Okay, let's begin. Good evening, everyone. I'm Paul Bramadette, and I'm the director of the CSRS at the University of Victoria. Welcome to our 10th Thursday public lecture of the winter series. These talks give us a chance to show off some of the wonderful work being done by the grad students, UVic faculty, and I'm pleased to introduce Lauren Strumos, a PhD candidate from the Religious Studies Department at the University of Ottawa, who completed her MA in the Religious Studies program at Queen's University in 2018. Lauren's deeply involved in the large international interdisciplinary project entitled Non-Religion in a Complex Future, led by Laurie Beeman and housed at the University of Ottawa. We at the Center are very pleased to be involved in this project and look forward to ongoing collaborations with Laurie and her team, including Lauren. We'd like to also thank Laurie for having such wonderful students. My colleagues and I have been really grateful to have Lauren with us this year. She's really deepened our conversations around environmental politics, what it might mean to have a distinctly non-religious ethical stance toward complex social problems, and how one might meaningfully engage in research in which Indigenous claims and communities are front and center. Lauren has published and presented on issues ranging from ethical veganism, controversies over Indigenous smudging in public schools, yoga, and connections between religion and the environment. Her work perfectly complements our efforts to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanish peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. And so please join me in welcoming Lauren Strumos to the digital stage of the CSRS. Take it away, Lauren.
Great. Thank you, Paul, for that very nice introduction, and many thanks to you and Noriko and Rachel and Scott for welcoming me this year to the center. I can definitely say that being part of the CSRS community this year has been one of the most intellectually rewarding experiences I've had pursuing my PhD thus far, so thank you. Oh, there we go. Early in the morning of September 28th, 2021, a Royal Canadian Mounted Police tactical team had arrived at this tree sit camp in Burnaby, British Columbia, to enforce an injunction and remove settler or non-Indigenous land defenders occupying the tree sit that was built in the way of the Trans Mountain Expansion Project. The Trans Mountain Expansion Project, or the TMX project, entails the construction and operation of an interprovincial oil pipeline that runs alongside the existent Trans Mountain oil pipeline. And you can see here on the map, it starts just outside of Edmonton, Alberta, and Métis homelands in Treaty 6 First Nations territory. And then it crosses unceded Indigenous lands in the province of British Columbia, where it comes to an end at the Burrard Inlet of the Salish Sea, which is a marine area located in the traditional and unceded territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Musqueam nations. So the current Trans Mountain pipeline exports around 300,000 barrels of oil per day from the Westridge Marine Terminal in the Burrard Inlet, pictured here on the left. And with this expansion project, this will almost triple to 890,000 barrels per day. The TMX project was purchased by the Canadian government in 2018 from Kinder Morgan Canada. The project's cost estimate just prior to this in 2017 was $7.4 billion. The most recent estimate from February of this year puts the project's costs now at $21.4 billion. And these increased costs are due to things like environmental protection measures, rising debt payments, and natural disasters, including the flooding and mudslides we had here in British Columbia last November and December. So this particular tree sit camp was built near Lost Creek in the Brunette River, in the Brunette River watershed, and it succeeded a previous camp that was located about 500 meters away at Holmes Creek and Cookite First Nation territory. And both the Lost Creek and Holmes Creek camps were occupied by members of Protect the Planet, a grassroots organization of settler activists that formed to stop the TMX project and tar sands expansion. So with the permission and guidance of local First Nations, the tree sits were constructed in the face of deforestation to make way for construction of the TMX project. And in addition to defending the trees that faced being clear-cut, members of Protect the Planet were working to defend the waterways, as well as the non-human animals who call this area home, use it as a nesting site, as well as a corridor. This includes the Nooksack dace, pictured here on the left, which is an endangered species that already faces high-risk harm from urbanization and sediment disposition in the Brunette River. The Brunette River is one of only 4 places in Canada inhabited by the fish. Another notable species is Anna's hummingbird, pictured here on the right, who actually brought a halt to the TMX construction from April to August 2021, after 2 hummingbird nests were found in the woodland corridor of an area meant to be clear-cut for the TMX project. And these active bird nests are protected by law under the Federal Migratory Bird Convention Act, and so they must be protected with a 30-meter buffer from all construction until the baby birds are able to fly. So the tree sit camp was maintained by ground volunteers who worked around the clock to support land defenders living up in the tree platforms and 2 sky pods. One of these sky pods is pictured here on the far left. They're essentially tarp hammocks that were hung high in the cottonwood trees in front of the tree platforms. So this middle image here is of the base of a tree platform that I took a week before the RCMP arrived to enforce the injunction. And then the far right photo is what remains of the tree sit. So for my doctoral research project, I've been conducting interviews with settler activists engaged in protests and direct action against the Trans Mountain Expansion project. I'm really interested in how they conceptualize the significance of their opposition to the project and its threats to both humans and nature, and how these are shaped by their religious and non-religious worldviews and cosmologies. Accordingly, I partially situate my research in an emergent area of study that focuses on those who identify as having no religion, and it's this part of my research that I will discuss for much of the talk this evening. So when I say the non-religious, I mean people who self-identify as atheists, humanists, agnostics, as well as those who are merely indifferent to religion. And just to provide some context, the number of those who identify with no religious affiliation has been notably increasing in Canada since the 1960s. So according to the National Household Survey conducted by Statistics Canada in 2011, 7.9 million people, or approximately 24% of the total Canadian population, identified as having no religion. In contrast, only 7.3% of the Canadian population identified as having no religion in 1981. More recently, according to Statistics Canada's 2019 General Social Survey, 32% of Canadians now have no religious affiliation. And of course, we're also waiting on more recent data from the census that won't be available until later this year in October. Social scientists who have turned their attention to non-religion have recently begun to focus on the substantive or positive content of non-religion instead of what the religious do not believe in. So that is, we know what the non-religious don't believe in, which is religion, but we can ask, what do they believe in? What are their views, attitudes, beliefs, practices, and lived experiences? In my case, I am particularly interested in capturing the ways the non-religious are imagining and interacting with the more than human world, and I'm using activist opposition to TMX as an entry point to do so. I wonder how non-religious land defenders think about the Nooksack dace, or Anna's hummingbird, and what this can tell us about human-non-human relations during an era of climate and ecological crises. Research focusing on non-religion and ecology remains relatively scarce, and almost no scholarship addresses how religious and non-religious peoples come together to address shared ecological concerns. One reason for this absence is that the ecological crisis is often framed as a moral crisis. In unprecedented ways, it calls upon humans entangled with the oppression of non-human nature and animals to reconsider their relations in a more than human world. Willis Jenkins notes that it is not unprecedented for a species to transform the biosphere. Upstart bacteria did it several billion years ago, radically remaking the atmosphere and banishing previously dominant species. It is unprecedented that a species should do so knowingly, worrying over the changes it makes, wondering if it imperils the systems on which life depends if it acts badly, if it risks its hopes for the future. That the ecological crisis is a moral crisis is reflected in religious studies scholarship that suggests although the crisis can be addressed by changes in science and technology and our political, social, and economic systems, addressing our flawed morality that caused the crisis in the first place must incorporate the wisdom found in religious traditions. This narrative emerges in part from a sentiment in and beyond scholarship that morality is tied to or emerges from religion. So if the ecological crisis is a moral crisis and morality is tied to or emerges from religion, the non-religion becomes excluded, irrelevant, or inadequate in scholarship concerned with transforming or restructuring human relationships with the earth. And so just to be sure, my point here is not that religion is an unimportant factor in addressing the ecological crisis, quite the contrary, but rather a narrow focus on religion as a source of ecological morality has left a gap in humanities and social science research that addresses human-non-human relations. Another reason for a lack of research on non-religion and ecology, I suggest, is an overemphasis that's placed on religious belief and cosmology, or what Willis Jenkins refers to as the cosmological temptation. When considering human relations in a more than human world, it's tempting to turn to worldviews and cosmologies as sites of transformation. This includes things like drawing on religious scriptures that suggest humans should live in harmony with the natural world, or explaining why non-human beings are morally significant to God or the divine outside of their use to humans. Speaking of this cosmological temptation, Jenkins writes that, reckoning with Anthropocene power and unprecedented problems can tempt ethicists to dwell in moral cosmology, proposing foundational metaphors and symbols by which agents could better interpret the world of human responsibility. That approach, I worry, draws ethical attention away from concrete problems, scientific learning, pluralist negotiations, and the dynamics of cultural change. Religious ethics is especially vulnerable to the cosmological temptation because it assigns such an important role to beliefs and because it often imagines that professional moralists take the lead in reforming those beliefs. Adding to this argument, I suggest that due to the conceptual ties among religion, belief, morality, and cosmology, scholarship that falls into the cosmological temptation also draws attention away from distinctly non-religious ways of being in the world. In an effort to resist this cosmological temptation, I take a bottom-up approach to my research, focusing on how individuals engaged in on-the-ground grassroots activism imagine and interact with the more than human world. So on that note, I'd like to share with you an experience described to me during an interview, the 35-year-old woman I'll refer to as Sarah. Sarah participated in the Lost Creek Tree Sit Camp last fall by offering ground support to those in the trees. Sarah doesn't self-identify as being religious, non-religious, or spiritual. And when asked how she describes her views of the world, she stated, "I just think that the time we are given is what we have, and I think that that's okay. I'm okay with it. I just want to live a meaningful life while I'm here. And the people I love them so much, but it's okay. Like when they're gone, I think they're gone, and that's okay. To clarify, you mean in the sense of no afterlife? She responds, yeah. In addition to offering ground support at the tree sit, Sarah also engaged in direct action last fall by sitting in front of a Trans Mountain cherry picker before the RCMP arrived to enforce the injunction. When talking to me about this experience and supporting one of her friends up in the sky pod, Sarah had said, I was there, so we were singing to my friend, and then a hummingbird came and landed in the tree next to him, and we were all like, what is happening right now? Like, I was not raised to be religious, and I am not particularly religious, but I would be lying to you if I said I hadn't had profound experiences in those woods. Like when I was sitting in front of the cherry picker, a rabbit came and sat on my foot. And I was like, that's not normal. I was like, thank you, bunny. Sarah described profound experiences with non-human animals while engaging in direct action against the TMX project, but she doesn't label them or describe them with religious language. Another one of my participants, a 30-year-old man named Michael, said that, quote, the natural world is fundamentally a part of ourselves. But he made it clear to me that this view is not spiritual, stating that he actually hates the term spiritual because it's, quote, too wooey. Michael has helped to organize rallies and marches against the Trans Mountain Expansion Project, and he understands the project to be a symptom of the fragmentation between humans and the natural world. Michael highlighted that he envisions a more harmonious relationship between humans and the planet, and that through addressing the climate crisis, we can arrive at this harmonious relationship. When elaborating on this ideal relationship, Michael explained that it entails learning what nature needs to thrive and ensuring that there are the best opportunities to do that. He further stated, you know, instead of saying how many fish can we take out of this river before the fish collapse, or how much oil we can spill in this river before the fish collapse, it's, you know, what do we need so that the river is as full of fish as it can be, and we all have enough fish forever? And so do the birds and the trees and the bears and all the other beings that rely on them too. Both Sarah and Michael spoke about non-human animals without drawing upon explicitly religious or spiritual language, and they leave no room for misinterpretation. Sarah stated that she is not particularly religious, but still had profound experiences with non-human animals in the woods. Michael sees humans as being one interconnected part of the natural world, yet he hates the term spirituality. So in seeking to better understand human-non-human relations, as expressed by my non-religious participants, I've turned to theories of ecological justice. Theories of ecological justice emerge from the concept of environmental justice, which holds that socioeconomic, racial, and ethnic minorities in society face an unequal burden of environmental harms, such as air, water, and land pollution. As a political theory, environmental justice emerged following a 1980s grassroots movement that protested thousands of tons of toxic soil from being dumped in Warren County, North Carolina, which had the highest number of African American residents than anywhere else in the state. While environmental justice focuses on humans, ecological justice extends justice to non-human entities by recognizing their inherent rights to flourish and be free from human-caused harm. This form of justice includes what Western thought traditionally deems to be sentient and non-sentient life, including trees, water, and landscapes. So for instance, both Brian Baxter and Anna Winehouse proposed distributive theories of ecological justice, which assert that non-humans deserve the material conditions they need to not only survive, but flourish. And humans have a moral obligation to refrain from inhibiting their flourishing. These material conditions include entities like land and water, but also life support systems such as pollination. Theories of environmental and ecological justice recognize that injustices faced by humans and non-humans are interrelated. David Schlossberg notes that when we interrupt, corrupt, or defile the potential functioning of ecological support systems, we do an injustice not only to human beings, but also to all of those non-humans that depend on the integrity of the system for their own functioning. Thus, ecological justice recognizes interconnections between humans and non-humans, but it doesn't erase these distinctions entirely. It maintains the categories of human and non-human, while challenging an anthropocentric view that humans have inherent moral rights to be free from harm and flourish, while non-humans are denied the subjecthood and agency required by these rights. Plumwood states that the concept of the human is itself very heavily normative. The notion of being fully or properly human is made to carry enormous positive weight, usually with little examination of the assumptions behind this, or the inferiorization of the class of non-humans this involves. Ecological justice addresses the assumptions behind the concepts of human and non-human, and in doing so, challenges the inferiorization of those who fall on the non-human side. A key feature of ecological justice is that it confronts injustice. It confronts power. In the context of the Trans Mountain Expansion Project, justice for non-human life confronts the injustices posed by the TMX project and the colonial law, policy, and governance that enabled it in the first place. For instance, one major threat of the project is the impact of increased marine oil shipping on the southern resident killer whales of the Salish Sea, who are an endangered species listed in Canada's Species at Risk Act. Burdens faced by the whales include increased underwater noise and strikes from marine vessels, and of course, an oil spill that would gravely harm the well-being and lives of the whales, their waters, and their food. During consultation for the TMX project, the National Energy Board, which has since been renamed the Canada Energy Regulator, had determined that the impacts of the TMX project on the southern resident killer whales were one of the only environmental harms that cannot be mitigated by the project, or in the project. The other two harms were the increased greenhouse gas emissions from more marine oil shipping, as well as the environmental impact of a potential oil spill. The National Energy Board also noted that the traditional cultural use of the whales by Indigenous peoples cannot be significantly mitigated. And the language of traditional use and traditional cultural use is the National Energy Board's. So thus the TMX project not only impacts the whales, a form of ecological injustice, but also the spiritualities of Indigenous communities that depend upon the well-being and presence of the whales in the Salish Sea. This is a form of environmental injustice. So for instance, during consultations with the National Energy Board, the Sartlip First Nation had mentioned or had explained that they hold a deep spiritual relationship with the whales, and that they act as their spiritual intermediaries between the Sartlip First Nation and their other relatives of the deep. So I'd like to also note that the division between justice for humans and justice for the environment or nature does not resonate with Indigenous environmental justice concepts. Environmental justice, informed by relational and holistic Indigenous ontologies, necessarily entails justice for all beings and entities. Kyle White explains that kinship, or the qualities of relationships humans have with others, both human and non-human, is particularly important to understanding Indigenous environmental justice. He writes that, for hundreds of years, invasion, exploitation, and colonization have greatly harmed Indigenous peoples. These acts of violence and oppression are sponsored by nation states, corporations, nonprofit entities, and discriminatory persons in their daily behavior. One way of understanding environmental injustice is as an assault on kinship relationships. Reciprocity is one of the kinship relationships that has been threatened, most in cases of environmental injustice against Indigenous peoples. Brian Baxter frames ecological justice as an alternative to the human-non-human relations posed by stewardship, which also maintain the human-non-human divide characteristic of Western thought. The concept of stewardship has religious and especially Christian roots, and broadly defined, it holds that humans have a unique duty to care for creation on behalf of God. Scholarship on stewardship largely emerged in response to Lynn White's well-known article, The Historical Roots of the Ecological Crisis. White was the first to link religious cosmology to anthropocentrism by placing blame on Christianity for the world's ecological crisis, calling Christianity the most anthropocentric religion the world has ever seen. White argued that medieval Christian dogma placed humans in a transcendent position of dominion over nature as its rightful masters. This established a conceptual human-nature dualism, and it was accompanied by a divine will that man exploit nature for his proper ends. In response to White's dominion narrative, many religious thinkers argue that humans are entrusted with the duty to care for God's creation as stewards. This view came forward in some of my interviews with religious individuals opposed to the Trans Mountain Expansion project. Emily, for example, is a 39-year-old Christian who joined a direct action prayer circle group that sometimes formed prayer circles at TMX worksites and risks arrest by blocking TMX equipment. In addition to dealing with her anxiety of the climate emergency, Emily engaged in direct action against the TMX project as a way to stand in solidarity with Indigenous groups opposed to the project, and out of concern for the impact that climate change will have on children and their futures. Explaining a third motivation for opposing the TMX project, Emily stated, "I think a third reason has to do with just the sense of call as a Christian. Like my theology being that I believe that we're all here as caretakers of the earth, as people called to tend it and love it and delight in it and protect it. And so that would lead me to opposing something that I believe is not going to do those things, like the pipeline expansion." When I asked Emily to elaborate on what being a caretaker meant to her, she continued, "I think it's rooted in a deeper concept of being interrelated with all of creation. Like, I believe I am a created being. I believe in evolution. I think that's the mechanism by which I was created, but that I'm deeply related to all other species, plants, animals, fungi, and everything. It's part of a complex web that's so interdependent, and that's how I believe the Creator meant for it to be." And what I take from the book of Genesis, but also from different parts of Scripture, even watching the way Jesus interacts with animals in the natural world, is that we're created almost like priests in a temple. If the earth were a temple, that we're the ones that are charged with, tending to it. And some people call that like a dominion, like more of a ruling over. But I think when I look at those Hebrew words, and when I look at the context of them, has more to do with the responsibility to tend and to till and to create a space that's diverse and beautiful and sustainable for a long period of time. The idea that humans do not have dominion over the earth, but stand as its caretakers, can also be expressed from non-religious perspectives. Often non-religious versions of stewardship place emphasis on caring for nature on behalf of future human generations instead of God. Christoph Baumgartner, for example, proposes a planetary stewardship in the Anthropocene. He writes that a Christian understanding of stewardship can be defined as the God-given mandate of humanity to preserve the earth for the future. The obligations of humanity in view of creation are direct obligations to God, who is understood as creator and owner of the earth. The Christian notion of stewardship has an essentially conservative orientation in the sense that the steward is responsible for the preservation of the good entrusted to him or her. In other words, the steward has to take care that the earth is not destroyed or damaged, and that it functions as a living environment for future plants, animals, and humans alike. Planetary stewardship in the Anthropocene, on the other hand, can be understood as the responsibility of current humanity to ensure a functioning Earth system for future generations of humanity. The obligations that are part of planetary stewardship in the Anthropocene are grounded in future generations of humanity and their rights to a hospitable environment. Jason, a 69-year-old who participated in the tree sits, self-identified as a practicing atheist who also expressed notions of stewardship. When asked what a practicing atheist means to him, Jason explained to me, "It's my funny little way of describing it. It means I say that I'm an atheist. You know, there are probably a lot of atheists in the closet who really don't want to say because all their friends are religious." Jason explained to me that as far as intelligence is concerned, humans are, quote, just off the scale. And this should lead us to wanting to take care of the earth, because by destroying the earth that gives us life, we destroy ourselves. Or as Jason exactly worded it, quote, "You just don't want to destroy the thing that gives you life." As an intelligent species, caring for the earth should be the ultimate relationship we have with the earth. But we have a problem because we are doing exactly the opposite. Although Jason referred to the intelligence of humans in explaining our role as caretakers, he did also reference religion. He stated, "Religion it's one of our best kind of models and description of incredibly important dimensions of that world. So when the Bible says we have dominion over the world, I take that to mean we have care over the world. So we're supposed to be the guardians, the caretakers of the world." Other activists I interviewed expressed ideas that countered notions of stewardship or caretaking, and some even explicitly struggled with the stewardship framework. 64-year-old Gordon, who has participated in protests and rallies against the TMX project, does not self-identify as religious or Christian, but he attends church frequently on Sundays, which he described as a community of gentle people, and it just so happens that this community exists in Vancouver where he lives. Although he does struggle with certain aspects of the congregation and has some cognitive dissonance, he tells people that he is glad he has found a loving community where he can show up with his vulnerabilities. When I asked Gordon how he sees humans' place in the world in relation to nature, he replied, "I do struggle. In First Genesis, dominion, and then, but of course in Second Genesis, we talk about stewardship, and I think that's a remnant, certainly of Christian faith, that it still needs a lot more wrestling to put us in our place in the order of things." He continued, "I do struggle with, is there something special about us, about us two-legged ones, who have the ability to, or some of us have had the ability to, write great operas and paint a painting that can move you to tears just by looking at it. But I think that's a little bit of arrogance. There's a level of arrogance in there and blindness." Gordon continued to explain that stewardship ultimately supports a separation between humans and nature that, to a certain extent, reflects a relationship of humans as master and nature as servant. This view resonates with that of Laurie G. Beeman, who argues that stewardship is dominion light, and that even with the addition of caring, it is ultimately hierarchical and validates human moral superiority. So some of the views of my participants, both religious and non-religious, can be analyzed within a framework of stewardship. Others, however, do not fit neatly into this framework, and rather what I'm proposing is that they reflect notions of ecological justice. In opposition to stewardship, in which a division remains between stewards and the stewarded, theories of justice necessitate that equal moral consideration is given to humans and non-humans without appeals to humans' unique responsibilities of caretaking or stewardship. So although my research suggests that stewardship can be used to describe the substantive or positive content of the religious and non-religious, I propose there's also alternative visions of human-non-human relations that better resonate with this framework of ecological justice. I'm still in the process of conducting fieldwork this spring for my doctoral project, so regrettably, I don't have any definitive conclusions to offer you today. But to make clear what I'm proposing and to draw all of these concepts together, I'd like to conclude by sharing with you a quote from a 49-year-old woman named Justine, who spent 5 days living in a treehouse at the Protect the Planet tree sit camp. Justine is not religious, but thinks that, quote, having a spiritual connection to things is important. She described feeling connected to the trees and the ecosystem during her time at the tree sit, and she said that her opposition to the TMX project provided her with a sense of security and trust that she doesn't have to be in charge of everything. Talking to me about her time in the tree sit, Justine has stated, I mean, we have frogs that are hanging out, like two little adorable frogs. Actually, one's quite big, hanging out next to the tree sit. And I always say hi to them when we go by and check to make sure and try not to scare them. And it's like, find my route around to get there. And this is their home. This is where they live. They don't have anywhere else to go. I mean, the reason they're here in that zone and not over in the pretty part of the Greenway by the Brunette River is because while people are walking their dogs and there's people running, we've already claimed that. And we made it look nice for us, right? And this idea that, well, this piece isn't useful to us, but it's useful to all these other creatures that need it. They needed a place to be, and they needed a place just to live and have the right to have that just without us coming in and ripping it up to put in a pipeline so that a few people can make some money. So Justine indicates that the frogs and other creatures have a right to their home, and this reasoning centers on the flourishment of the non-human animals. That is, consideration of these animals is not justified by a reason other than the animals themselves. When analyzed within a framework of ecological justice, injustice emerges from the construction of the TMX pipeline through which human influence threatens the home of the frogs and other creatures. And this approach is certainly interpretive, and that she doesn't use language of justice herself. However, employing ecological justice here as a conceptual tool nevertheless helps to locate her concern for non-human animals that, 1, does not use religious language, 2, does not present the hierarchy of stewardship, and 3, confronts a power imbalance between these animals and those who want to, quote, put in a pipeline so that a few people can make some money. And that is all. Thank you.
Thanks, Lauren. That's great. All right, so we have about 20 minutes for some questions, conversation. And as Rachel reminds you, you can either speak out loud. I think we know most of the folks with us today, or you can put a question in the chat box and either Rachel or I will pose it on your behalf. Peter. Oh, Scott, you have to there you go.
Well, Lauren, we've been waiting for this for 6 months, so thanks very much for a great talk. I'm curious to hear your, you've been doing religious studies for a long time. Do you think that the spirituality that the people do or do not have is, I'm thinking jumbled. I have a sense from other reading that I've done of some of my environmental activist friends that they're thinking of what religion is and spirituality is somehow jumbled and maybe affected by the questioner. Do you have a sense of your own role in asking those questions and then their answers coming back?
No, it's a great question. Thank you. I definitely thought about that too when sort of building this project and making the interview schedule. So one thing I did is I don't ask about sort of religion or spirituality or even non-religion until the very end of the interview to see how much this is brought forward by the participants themselves. And then only sort of towards the end, before I kind of get to the more demographic questions, I ask sort of how they see their views of the, or how they would describe their views of the world, and sometimes whether or not they consider themselves to be religious, and then you see how they respond. So, I mean, of course, they know ahead of time that I'm doing my PhD in religious studies, so I'm sure there might be some sort of influence over there, but it definitely is something I try to avoid, just so I can do what I can to avoid, imposing those concepts on them.
Just to pick up on Peter's question, though, which I think is a very good question, both methodologically and substantively. Do you find that when you do get to that topic and you do invoke those categories, that the way they have understood the categories reflects this kind of mixing? So one thing I think one might think about is sort of the gradation between sort of stewardship, Jesus type framing of the natural world versus the hardcore dominionist type, right? Do you have a sense that they kind of mush those together, or that they have an appreciation of the wide range of approaches within biblical traditions that one finds?
That's a good question. Yeah, I'll definitely have to keep that in mind when I go back to the data analysis. I do think, I mean, obviously I'm interviewing environmental activists too, so that sort of dominion narrative doesn't come up. But there is quite a bit of, even when someone's not religious, kind of stating that they still respect religions, or sort of respecting religious views of the world.
I guess, sorry, Lauren, what I meant by the dominion sensibility is that they might assume that, well, a religious approach to the environment must be, by definition, a dominionist approach. In other words, it must be hierarchical. So I just wonder if they assume that, and therefore they opt rather for spirituality than something called religion, even though in fact within the category of religious approaches to the environment, there's a whole range.
Yeah, no, I don't think so. Off the top of my head, no, I don't think I've encountered that. I think, when spirituality does, someone identifies as spiritual, it is, as I'm sure you would assume, comes up as spiritual but not religious. And religion in that sense is often thought of, sort of the world religions paradigm, as opposed to being articulated first and foremost as sort of an eco-spirituality. It's I'm spiritual but not religious.
Okay, thank you. Amy and Dominique.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciated your presentation. And I was hoping maybe to ask you the question that sometimes Rachel asks you, or anybody who comes to us, to make that connection between what you personally have felt wanting to get out of your research. So there's probably your own connection with the religion, spirituality, and the other. And so you're looking into these various other people who do things that one could have done out of religious beliefs, whatever that might be. And secondarily, increasingly, as you've demonstrated in your work, we see Canadians as a collective reduce their religiosity. You've quoted the census statistics. And so one might have the hypothesis that a lot of people are falling out of love with institutional religion as defined by authorities and structures and rules. but that still leaves the door open to the conversation already started by Peter and picked up on by Paul about how they may actually be misunderstanding what the profound essence may have been of religion, and that they conflate the criticism that one could have from institutionalized religion and its portrayal through institutions and structures, and mix that up with what could be religion if one was stripping religion away from these powers, structures, and institutions, and what remains could be religious, but they might not identify that as religion, but rather the institutional structures that we've identified as those entities of religion. Again, trying to rephrase some of what we've already discussed, but also looking at it maybe from this angle of identifiable religion and what people think it might be. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, great. Thank you, Amy. And I mean, that's certainly a limitation too when you're looking at surveys or census data as well, where you kind of just, check a box regarding how you identify. Yeah, I think obviously too, context is really important, paying attention to how people use terms like religion and spirituality. And I think sometimes as well, kind of ideas or notions that come up, such as sort of like interconnections with the natural world, that are often labeled as spiritual or spirituality, but the participants don't always necessarily use language of spirituality themselves. So it is a little bit difficult, but I think, again, kind of paying attention to context, and especially in my interviews too, paying attention to sort of the interview as a whole, and not just sort of like the end with the religion question, but seeing if these sort of notions of what they may call or some might call religion or spirituality sort of come up in other parts of the interview, and looking at it more holistically. I hope, does that address your question?
Oh, Scott.
Sorry. Should I ask?
Scott is still trying to figure out how to unmute Amy. There we go.
No worries. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And I think it answers the question. Maybe I can now just follow up to my first question, the one that I said Rachel would sometimes ask us of anybody presenting, sort of making that connection. Obviously, when you're doing religious studies, you're interested in religion yourself. But if you could, I don't know, lift up a bit the veil of what may be triggering your own interest in this question. So is it something that you would find there's more religion out there than people admit, or are you quite the opposite? We don't maybe need as much religion because these profound norms and values are found in people independent of religion, which could be an instrument that helps us teach these values of humanity, spirituality, and connectivity.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, again, drawing back to context too, like in British Columbia, in 2011 as well, it was the province with the highest percentage of its population identifying with no religion. It's about 1.9 million people. So I'm definitely kind of curious about what that means for thinking about human, non-human relations, and sort of the associations people link to or make to between sort of ethics, morals, and values and religion. And yeah, I'll definitely have to think about this more, and definitely bring it up at our coffee talk tomorrow as well, about sort of my own personal interests. But I definitely think that there's something there, and something intriguing to me too, that non-religion has been such a neglected area of study for so long, and it requires a lot of creative thinking as well to kind of understand how it's appearing in contemporary society, and especially in British Columbia too, where you have these sort of environmental movements. So I'll ponder this some more. I'll get back to you tomorrow.
Thanks, Lauren. Dominique.
Yes, I wanted to ask a question about at the end of your talk, because you were talking about this woman who is non-religious, and then you went back to this to the justice model. So instead of invoking religion or stewardship, we could invoke a model of justice that is secular, right? And I was wondering if you had, in your dialogue with some of your subjects, if you had talked about if you had, if sorry, I'm not making sense. If it's something that you impose intellectually at the end of your talk, or if it's something also that comes out of the discussions that you have with the people that you met during those protests. Is it something that is it an intellectual category that you find useful yourself to make sense of what the non-religious, how the non-religious think about the relationship with the environment? Do you think that this conception of justice could be useful to them, though they themselves do not think that way? Or is it something also that arises bottom up, as you mentioned?
Yeah, thank you. Definitely. Environmental justice has come up during interviews. That sort of bottom up approach, especially when talking about Indigenous rights to land and water, and sort of the impact of the pipeline on some Indigenous communities. In terms of ecological justice, yeah, I'm definitely kind of using it as an interpretive framework, more of a conceptual tool, and kind of thinking, you know, in seeking to understand the more substantive or positive content of the non-religious in relation to the environment. I find kind of these tools already there, such as frameworks of stewardship, for example, aren't quite articulating some of what I'm finding and some of what I'm seeing. And so for me, these theories of justice are able to do that in a way that, again, is sort of context specific and confronts power, as I had mentioned in the pipeline, which is, I think, key to understanding to environmental activism specifically.
But just to and then very fast, this last person with whom you talked to at the end of your talk, if you told her, well, I think that what you're trying to say, you know, you should read those people who write about ecological justice, do you think that it would have resonated with her?
I do. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay,
Yeah, thank you.
thanks. Martin.
Okay, didn't quite get time to formulate my question as articulately as I might in principle, but I'm wondering whether in your conversations with these different people from different backgrounds, both religious and non-religious, the topics ever, or whether your questions ever took you in the direction of analyses of not just I guess you seem to be talking more about where the sense of responsibility and activism comes from, but I'm thinking more about, you know, how they see the causes of the problem, you know, the kind of analyses of, you know, religious analyses of, you know, free choice, for example, and humans' free will, you know, or some other cosmological framework, like, or in the Buddhist case, you know, whether, you know, people sometimes trace these things back to, you know, greed and ignorance and so on. So I'm wondering, you know, whether your questioning took you into the direction of, you know, understanding how religious and non-religious folks understood the root causes of the problem, not just the, you know, what's motivating them to act, the sense of stewardship and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, no, great. Thank you, Martin. In terms of root causes, yeah, certainly the one participant I mentioned, sort of this fragmentation too between humans and nature, like this sort of very foundational kind of divide or sort of a lack of connection. And then also kind of pointing to sort of more structural issues like capitalism, reliance on fossil fuels, things like that. So definitely, yeah, I'm trying to think if there's anything else, but I think definitely this idea of sort of people needing to sort of reconnect with nature and sort of get over this human nature divide that's been leading to this exploitation of the earth has been a theme.
Are there people in are there participants in your study who have who try to take account of the tremendous violence that we see in nature? In other words, one of the benefits of a religious framing of the world is it's got this kind of sin, good, evil, suffering. It's got these kind of theodicies. It's got this kind of complex architecture for understanding why people do bad things to each other and to the world, and to, you know, why you should do bad things to that neighboring ethnic religious group. And I wonder, so much of what we see in nature, although on the one hand can be seen as, well, that's that's just a natural flow of things. But actually, if you're a mouse being eaten by a hawk, there is, you know, tremendous violence there. I wonder sometimes when I speak to activists, sometimes they have a very romantic view of the natural world, and I wonder if is there any sense among the people you're talking with of needing to struggle with the actual struggle within nature, or do they have kind of a rosy view of it?
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Thanks, Paul. I'm trying to think. I don't think romanticized views of nature so much have come up. I think in part too because my interviews it is focused on this pipeline expansion project, so it's more so seen as human relationships with nature and what's often framed as unnecessary. So almost in a negative sense, what we should not be doing. So we should not be building this new pipeline, for example. So it hasn't really gone in the direction for the most part, and sort of wrestling with these ideas of nature more wholly that you've mentioned. I'm trying to think. Yeah, nothing really comes to mind. I can't really recall an interview where that has happened. But I think again, part of it is because it is focused on this pipeline expansion project that's being done as humans, and again, sort of it's more almost a negative articulation of rights, like what we should not be doing. We should not be building this pipeline. We should not be contributing to fossil fuels, etc.
I guess the assumption is that humans have these unnatural and irrational appetites to consume way more than we need, whereas the frog and the eagle and the bear kind of consume within some sort of natural framework. I suppose that's probably an assumption behind many of the things they're arguing.
Mm-hmm.
And that TMX is a problem precisely because it doesn't anticipate negative outcomes, and it takes from the earth more than we ought to.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Whereas in the natural world, there is this, the argument is, the assumption always is in the natural world, there's a greater kind of, as it were, natural respect for the harmony of all beings. Whether that's actually true or not is a separate question, but it is a kind of an article of faith in some sense among these folks, even though when an invasive species comes in, it'll just take over everything.
Yeah, and I mean, our understandings of nature too are quite culturally or socially constructed as well. And I think the kind of view of nature coming across in the work I've been doing is that it's really understood in our kind of current era of heightened global awareness of the climate and ecological crises. So sort of this romanticized view is not kind of what's at the front of mind. What's at the front of mind is our predicament, what we're in right now. And that's really framed views of nature. For instance, humans, I find, are talked about sort of like as a species, the species level, like what humans as a species have done to the earth, for instance. So I think it, again, keeping, or rather the context is really key, I think, in how nature's been framed in the interviews I've been doing.
That's a really good point, to put it against that big backdrop of what's at stake here for kind of all life on Earth. That's really helpful. So thanks very much, Lauren. We'll tease this out a bit more tomorrow. Now, Talia or Scott, I wonder if we can give people a sense of the very special event next week. So just so you know, there's 2 more lectures, and the one next week is actually an unusual one because it's longer, it's in person, and it's catered, which is going to be lovely. We're going to have the chance to see our 2 artists in residence this term, Estraven and Patrick, will share their work. It's going to be wonderful. One of them is a weaver, and Patrick is a musician and improvisational musician and faculty member in the music and fine arts faculty here. So please come by, and please remember that you need to register for this, just so that we know how many people to expect and how much food to buy and so forth. So it'll be a special event. We felt like it was time now that we could actually be together in person more readily. And then Cheyenne McAllister is the following week, but she is joining us from the mainland, so she'll be coming to us by Zoom. But next Thursday, April 7th, at 5 o'clock, And it's in the sub upper lounge, which is not hard to find in the Student Union building. And you can stick around for the whole event from 5 to 7:30, or you can just come for either Estraven or Patrick. But it'll be a nice social event, very relaxed, and have some chance to have something to eat and drink together. All right, if you have questions, please get in touch with me or Rachel, Scott, or Noriko. We can fill you in. Looking forward to seeing all of you. Thanks again, Lauren, for a very fine lecture, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye, everybody. Have a good weekend.